Greetings everyone, my name is Cedric Chuuma for Financial Insight Zambia and welcome to the property series. Right now I am joined by managing partner of 𝗬𝗲𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗁 Investments as well as Frontier Capital Partners, Mwiya Musokotwane. Mwiya, how are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, glad to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So are you able to tell us the story of Quashi, what is the why behind it, as well as the importance of such developments for the economy?
Sure. So Nkwashi is a mixed-use development. It's about a 45-minute drive out of Lusaka. If Crossroads in Woodlands is where you see the boundary of Lusaka on the eastern side. So it's about 45 minutes from there. It is a 3,100-acre estate with 9,600 residential subdivisions and approximately about 400 to 500 acres of land committed to commercial uses of various sorts. So for instance, education, industrial, office, retail, and such like.
So are you able to tell us the investor sentiment for such developments from your perspective as managing partner at 𝗬𝗲𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗁 Investments as well as Frontier Capital Partners?
Yeah, I can, and I think there's actually a component of the previous question that I didn't address, which is the why.
Yes.
So when we started in Quashi, started selling in 2014, we saw that there was a general lack of planned settlements around Lusaka. And we saw there was a lot of activity taking place where people were subdividing land and just selling it, oftentimes without any development work being considered. So for instance, there would be no development of roads, there would be no development of power lines, there would be no development of water infrastructure. It was kind of like do it yourself. Just give you a plan and a plot and you proceed. And from where we sat, we felt that that was going to lead to a very big public health problem in the future. And we can already see, like this year, for instance, the cholera outbreak is an example of such a public health problem coming out of unplanned or improperly planned settlements. So because we saw that there was a lot of activity of that sort happening already, we knew that there was demand. And that was buttressed by the fact that the demographic information was showing us that there was a lot of unmet demand. So a deficit existed to the extent that it was about 3 million houses or homes that would be in deficit by 2030. So we felt that there was an impetus for us to get involved because we had the land, we had proximity to Lusaka, and we felt that we could do things better by putting together a comprehensive master plan that would take all the various components of city living into consideration. So for instance, you'd have planned roads and you'd pave them, water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, green spaces like a park, recreational spaces like a lake. You'd have mixed income, so it wouldn't just be one demographic that lives in this neighborhood or city. It would be multiple types of income brackets who would be living there. You would have multiple types of sort of work opportunities, so you have to incorporate those into a master plan. So you have academic, you have commercial, you have industrial. So all those things were considered. So we hired one of the continent's best master planning and architectural firms to do this work for us. And they did a good job. And we started selling off plan initially. And that's what basically kicked things off for us in 2014. We ultimately we're doing this because we felt that there was a significant constraint in what's called state capacity, or in this particular case, municipal capacity, where the public sector, like councils in this instance, just don't have the capacity to be developing new communities like this. So for instance, you're fairly young yourself, there's a place that you might want to call home, but there are no places where municipalities are actually actively creating spaces for people like yourself to actually go buy a property and then live in comfort that is correlated to your expectations of your lifestyle. So private players have to get involved in developing those. So that's why we got involved, because we felt that we could be a positive contributor to that. In terms of the sorts of investor feelings about this type of project, it's quite significant. if we look at the continent, for the reasons I've mentioned again. So demographically, Africa is the fastest growing place in the world, population-wise. So right now, we're about 1.3, 1.4 billion people in our continent. By 2050, it will be around 2.5 to 3 billion. So we'll basically double. And by 2100, we'll double again to about 6 billion people, right? There's nowhere else on this planet where people are growing at this sort of like level. And so betting on infrastructure is a very long-term bet on the ability for value to be created by supporting the emergence of middle classes in particular in Africa. Because like I mentioned about yourself, there are many people like you across the continent who are saying, oh, I need a decent place to live. And then, you also be working somewhere, and an employer will then say, oh, I need a decent office to work out of, or, decent roads to drive on. And the bet that investors are making is that because state capacity is just not there in Africa, the private sector is going to be the party that acts on this, the actor that's going to act on this to provide a means of bridging that gap. So in the case of Zambia, that's also been true. So a lot of the capital that's come into new settlement development in Zambia has actually been foreign. So if you look at some of our competitors, they've got capital that's come out of elsewhere in the world. So for instance, Roma Park has got a partnership with Rendezvous, which is partly Russian. Kingsland, Chinese, so there's active appetite. In our case, we've been entirely self-funded, so we haven't partnered with external parties at this point. But for some of the newer components of our master plan, specifically around things like commercial real estate development, hospitality and such like, we are now actively speaking with partners. So that's something that we've been very excited about.
And it's a massive project, 9,600 homes, and as when it was announced, it was valued at 1.5 billion. So obviously such a project comes with its own challenges. Mm-hmm. What are some of these challenges that you have faced over the lifeline of the project, and how have you mitigated them and overcome them?
Sure, that's a good question. So, building things of this sort, where it's infrastructure, it's housing, it's land development, these are long-term investments by their nature. They're very generational everywhere in the world. So in answering your question, I'll give you an example of my favorite city project. It's a city called Irvine in America. And Irvine was started in the 1950s on a cattle ranch. This cattle ranch was bought in the 1800s by a family, lived in California. And a guy called Donald Bren, who's actually the world's wealthiest real estate investor, purchased from that family this ranch over time and started developing it into a mixed-use development, much like Nkwashi is, except it's much larger. It's 50,000 hectares. So it's taken almost 50 to 60 years for that master plan to be fully developed in their case. And this is a massive development. Like I said, it's more than 50,000 hectares. We are much smaller. It's just 3,000 acres. But my point is, it requires a long time horizon. And in our case, if you look at the long time horizon that we're looking at, in the first 9 years of Nkwashi being developed, we have experienced 4 currency devaluations. Right. So when we first started the project in 2014, the exchange rate was about 6.2 kwacha to a US dollar. Within the first 18 months of operations, the exchange rate went to 12 kwacha to a US dollar. In another about 3, 4, 5 years, it went to 18. Then it went to 24. And then more recently, obviously, we had another devaluation cycle where it went to as high as 27 and it's come down now to 22. So from where we've been sitting, our initial financial models regarding this project, specifically around the issue of currency, you couldn't really forecast that it's going to get to 20 plus to a US dollar, because there was just no basis, to make that forecast. So I think that's been our biggest challenge. It's just that being able to plan long term as a consequence of these things has been quite constrained. And so you have to change your plans as you go along. You modify your plan. So for instance, a road which might have taken you a year to develop, you might say, okay, I'm going to develop this now over 18 months or 2 years, because the dollar cost is the same, but obviously you're selling your properties in Kwacha. Initially, we were actually indexing to the US dollar, but again, like I mentioned, with a devaluation where you see 4x increase in costs, you just can't pass that on to a customer. So we had to then fix our prices. But that has the effect then of obviously then eroding into margins, and you have to, you basically have to shift around costs in order to make that work, which is what we've done, and I think we've done that quite well. So the consequence obviously has been our timelines have now been extended, and that's the only acceptable thing you can do in that instance. But it means as well that if you're a foreign investor looking at coming into a market like this, because of the lack of stability in the exchange rate, it's a lot harder to then take that bet. So, as a local investor, we can take that bet because, number one, we've owned this land for over 20 years. So from a valuation perspective, I think there's all value which has accrued into that. Number two, you are, by definition, taking a long-term bet because you live here permanently. So you have to just roll with the punches, so to speak. So those are some of the challenges that we've faced. It's mostly been around exchange rate stability and inflation, because if you're building a power distribution grid, as an example, you have to import your transformers, you have to import your cabling, right? You have to import sometimes even the poles, right? So those are all US dollar costs. When you're building a road, you have to import the bitumen, right? You have to import the primer. You have to then also use machines like bulldozers, graders, and such like, which are themselves imported. And then you have to repair and maintain them, which all includes imports. You have to use cement, and whether we like it or not, there's a dollar component in the price of cement because they use electricity to make cement and they use fuel to mine cement. So all these things have an inflationary effect, right? And so you just have to then plan that around, number one, your pricing, right? So you have to take a very innovative view on your pricing. It might not be US dollar, but in Kwacha terms, you have to flex your pricing so that you can accommodate these costs. But at the same time, you can't flex so much that you stop being competitive on a pricing perspective. What's interesting is that we've actually seen that the general effect of all of this inflation on real estate prices has been that relative to their US dollar prices, like plot prices in Zambia have actually come down quite a lot. I'll give you an example. If you were selling a plot for, let's call it 150,000 kwacha in 2014, right? That would have been approximately something like all over $20,000, right? Now it's under $10,000. Okay, so even if you are selling that same plot for the same amount of money in kwacha terms today, in dollars you are making less. So prices in reality have come down. And like I mentioned, the development costs associated with actually doing something physical, so building a road, putting a power line there, transformer, these are all dollar costs. So really your margins have shrunk. So developers have actually been put under a lot of strain over the last decade because of all those effects that are taking place in the macroeconomy. It's just not visible because most people see a kwacha price. Yeah. So I think those are the big constraints. But for all of that, there's still a lot of demand for real estate. It just requires different models.
Yeah. And also you mentioned that it's self-funded for now, and you've just outlined some of the key challenges that you faced. Now, what model have you employed or are you employing to keep it financed? And have you varied the models as the dynamics changed? Are you operating on a new one now? Have you changed one key component that's going to be revenue based? What have you done to work around the model, or which model have you employed and constantly keep on working on?
Cool. Good question, actually. So before I answer that, as one thing I want to address, the headline development cost for Nkwashi, including every single person's home, eventually when office buildings are built, the industrial park is built, shopping centers, schools, and so on and so forth. That's the 1.5 billion. It's everyone's investment collectively, including the land value that we have created by then master planning this settlement, putting in core infrastructure, so the bulk infrastructure like roads and so on, power lines and so on. That is the 1.5 billion. It's not like we have $1.5 billion sitting on an account somewhere. That's not the case. That's number one. Number two, how to create that value. So speaking now to the business model that you're asking about. Yes. Our model has always been based off phased development. So when we first started in Quashi, we didn't just start with the big ambitious plan to say, oh, out of nowhere, we've got no experience in this, we're just going to build a project of this size and magnitude. We started with a smaller pilot. So the smaller pilot was selling small holdings. So we had about 400 acres of land that we master planned into a small agricultural estate. Again, 400 acres is not a great big farm. It's a moderately sized farm. And then we divided that into even smaller units of 5 acres each. And we sold those out in about 3 months. That gave us the experience of learning how to sell, learning how to build a project, package a project, put in infrastructure for a project. So in that case, we were building gravel roads. With the capital that we created from that first project, we then recycled that capital into Nkwashi. Right? So we then did the master plan for the broader project. We then started doing the initial infrastructure work. We put together the marketing impetus, and we basically just started Nkwashi as a going concern after that first initial pilot. And that capital is basically what kicked off Nkwashi. And the same model has been used with Nkwashi as well. So what we've been doing is, as we pre-sell, right, you take the capital that you're generating, because we sell on payment plans, so we know with reasonable level of estimation what our cash flows look like. We know reasonable level of estimation what our collections rates will be, and so on and so forth. So we use that cash flow to then invest in the infrastructure. So our business model is actually in many respects much more similar to a bank than it is to, say, a traditional real estate developer, where you sell a house and it's bank financed. So for instance, if I'm selling an apartment or a house to Cedric, Cedric will go to a mortgage lender, and that mortgage lender will give me, the developer, the money. Cedric then pays the mortgage lender on a payment plan, which is what the mortgage is, over, say, 10 to 30 years, right? I don't have to think about the credit risk. I've done my bit, which is sell him a house. In our case, because we're selling A, land, and B, there are fewer than 50,000 mortgages in Zambia, I would end up being something like 20% of mortgages if we sold out. We can't really rely on that model for ourselves. So we've taken on the role of the lender, in a sense, where we say to a person, oh, Cedric wants a piece of land from us. Okay, cool. Cedric, here's this plot. Pay us in 5 years. Pay us in 10 years. Right? So then Cedric has a credit obligation to us. So that's the model that we use. So we then sell in phases, knowing, okay, this phase is sold out. Let's go take infrastructure there. Then you do that also in a sequential way. You start off roads. Once people get ready to start building, you put in power lines and you put in water. So a question we'll often sometimes get is, why haven't you put out power lines and water in all these places? Like, okay, for which houses, right? Right. So what we typically do is you have a suburb. So for instance, we have a suburb called Eagle in a district called Tau in Quashi. It's completely sold out. There are about 300 plots in that suburb. The roads were done. People started building their homes. It's about 20% people started building their homes there. So we started putting in the power on a street-by-street basis. So this street, we know there's people building their homes, we'll put in the power. That other street, there's people building homes, put in the power. Why do we do that? Because then you're not tying up your capital in infrastructure that no one is using, right? Because, like I said, Cedric isn't going to a bank to build his house. Cedric is building himself, right? So after he pays for his plot, he takes a breather, he waits a bit, he starts saving again. Once he's saved enough to build a foundation, Cedric then goes, starts building a foundation. Then he builds up to lintel level. Then he roofs it. So typically it actually takes about 3-4 years, sometimes even 5 years for a person to build a house in Zambia. Because unlike our colleagues in America and the UK and South Africa, you're not going to a lender to borrow. You're building with your own cash, right? So consequently, we are on the other side of that, looking, waiting and watching and saying, okay, it looks like Cedric is about to move in. Then we come in and put in the infrastructure that you need. There are certain amounts of infrastructure where you can't wait. So for instance, water, you just do it regardless. But other sorts, you also have to wait. The other thing is security, right? You don't want to put infrastructure that is exposed to the elements and might be impaired because there's no use. So for instance, one thing we had to learn the hard way is that if you don't use roads when they're built, they actually get weaker. Right? So you want to have a certain level of traffic on a road so that the compaction of the road by the traffic makes it stronger. So initially, for instance, in Eagle, we built the roads to tar and we were waiting. In the newer suburbs that we have opened up because they've also sold out, what we've been doing is we'll build the road to a fairly advanced level right before tar, allow people to start building, and then tar it. And the reason why we're doing that is twofold. Number one, we don't want the damage, like I mentioned from before. Number two, as well, when people are building their homes, they're bringing in tipper trucks and all sorts of heavy-duty vehicles, and these roads are designed for low-duty vehicles. So if you didn't put in all that tar beforehand, I'm sure you've been on some of these roads, even Great North Road, for instance, you've seen that, how it's wavy. That's what you end up with. So those are some of the challenges that we've seen where, you don't really expect something initially and then you learn and then you modify your plans.
Okay, that's very, very interesting, actually. So you stated that it's a mixed purpose development, going to have homes, going to have schools, as well as even business parks. Are you able to let us know what are some of these developments and progress towards these developments as well?
Sure. So the progress that we've made regarding these developments at the moment, we built a public park with an art gallery in it. Obviously, we've got the dam, which serves two purposes. Number one is recreational, as well as number two, not in any order of importance, obviously, water use. The other developments we're currently working on is a school campus. So there's a primary and secondary school that we're in the process of constructing in Quashi. So that campus is actually being developed. The initial sets of classrooms are on their way to being completed as we speak. So this year we're looking forward to building more classrooms as well as putting in more sports infrastructure in Quashi. We had started and then paused on the university. So once we finished with the school, the next educational project to resume will be the university. So we're building that on balance sheet as well. And then off balance sheet, we're working with some partners who are looking at developing a boutique hotel in Nkwashi. So the designs for that have actually just been completed and now going through the process of being cleared through council. So the designs have to be cleared. So construction, we're hoping will start at some point this year. So those are the sorts of things that we're quite excited about at the moment.
Yeah. It's been a pleasure having you. Thank you so much for making the time.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much, Cedric.
This has been Cedric Chuuma for Financial Insight Zambia. Get to know.